Welcome to Kevin's European Garage, and today I'm going to be changing the steering rack on my 1999 Porsche 911. So I hope you consider subscribing to my channel and hitting that like button, and don't forget to hit the notification. If you do subscribe, that helps me get more content out to you, and that helps me just expand and grow this channel. So let's get going, and we'll start talking about the steering rack that we're putting in this car. So here's the steering rack that we put on the car. This one was remanufactured by Marvel. This was a more reasonably priced one. The only thing I don't like about the factory Porsche steering rack is this one is originally made by TRW, is that over here, this thing is completely splined everywhere. There's not like a notch where you can line up the steering column to this thing so it goes on easy. So what you're going to have to do is when you're putting this thing in, you're going to have to lock the steering wheel unless you want to try to mess with it to try to get it lined up. So I have a hood prop tool that I'm going to force behind the steering wheel to hold it in place while I'm doing this. I don't want it to move around, and you should try to find something that you can hold it in place also. It just makes it easier so that when you put this thing back together, it's somewhat close to where it needs to be before you go to get an alignment, and it'll make it easier for the guys aligning it, and it'll make it easier for you to drive it on the way there. So today's tech tip is that if you have lug nuts like these, you can't take them off with an impact gun. So make sure you loosen them up before you raise the car, and not like what I did. So let's moving on to putting that steering rack in. So before we start taking out this rack, we're just gonna drain out all the fluid as much as possible. So we're just gonna connect up a little pump. It's a little hand pump I got. I'm just gonna put it into an empty container and get all the fluid out. I say that's completely pumped, and now let's move on to the next step. All right, so let's loosen out the tie rod from the steering rack. It's gonna just make it easier to try to take them out without tie rods on. So it's loose. So when you remove this off of the steering rack, count how many times you spin this thing. That will make it so that when you get the car realigned, you'll be kind of somewhat close to where you used to be. And that was 26 turns. And while I'm doing this, I'm doing my best to keep the steering wheel locked in the center position. Okay, so now they get to the axis to the bottom bolt to hold the rack in and make it so you can easily drain the rest of the power steering fluid out of the rack. We gotta take off this cover underneath here. So I'm going to see if I can just leave this thing hanging over here instead of trying to take off those ones further back. I might end up having to do it, but I don't think it's going to be necessary. Just the drain pan is kind of not the best ideal location, but hopefully it doesn't go all over the place. All right, so the next thing I'm going to remove is the nut or the bolt right on the steering shaft over here. So I'm going to use a long extension and impact this to bang it out really fast so it doesn't twist this and knock it out of place. And then we just got to push this back. Hopefully this thing will just kind of slide back and it's not stuck on the shaft. Unfortunately, you got a rocket to get it off. Hopefully a lot easier getting on. All right, now you can see that I got the steering shaft off of the rack, and then now we're going to disconnect power steering hoses that go out to the pump, and then after that is the two bolts that hold it to the front subframe, and then this thing is ready to come out. Unfortunately, the bolt is kind of behind the line, so you can't really get a socket in there to do it. So you got to put an Allen wrench on it. 8mm Allen wrench. And now we can drain the fluid out. So now we got left is the 2 bolts. One of them is over here, and the other one is on the other side, and they're a 15 millimeter. All right, here we go. Let's get the steering rack out, and it looks like this thing's got like a little pin that holds it in place. Once you kind of get that out, you have to twist it. Coolant pipes are in the way. It's like you gotta rotate this thing, but it's not easy to rotate. And then kind of push up on the pipes at the same time to slide it out. Looks like I'm gonna have to drop the subframe a little bit on this side, and that might free up enough room where this will slide out. It only needs just a little bit more, but the hoses are in the way. All right, let's lower down this subframe. I don't want to take it completely out or drop it completely down. Just want to lower it down a little bit. So let's see if we can do this. The other thing I have to do is disconnect the sway bar link. All right, that's just enough to get the rack out now. Okay, now that I got the steering racks out of the car, you can see a slight difference in between them. I guess they're different years. This looked like a, this is like a later model one, and then this is the 99. But the thing is that if you look at these inner tie rods, they're a little loose compared to the ones I put on. I had just recently put on brand new TRW inner and outer tie rods. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my inner tie rods that I had and put them on the new one, and then take these and put them back on the ones I'm going to return. All right, so I'm going to put this in the vise and I'm going to get these things off. All right, so let's take out the inner tie rods on the new one. Okay, so now I got the old tie rods and everything cleared off of the reman rack. Now it's time to put in my TRW ones, and I put a little bit of blue Loctite on there just to make sure that they stay in there. And it's so much tighter than the ones that came off this rack. Now, hopefully they did a better job at doing the inside. Just gotta put the boots on, and then this thing's ready to go into the car. But before I even do that, they painted over the shaft, so I'm just gonna clean the shaft off and get rid of the paint on here to make the steering shaft easier to push down. TRW boot kit is much nicer than what they used. I'm still going to use their plastic clamps, at least I'm going to try to. Looks like I might not be able to. so this shaft is nice and clean. You got a couple little things to put on there. This came off of the original steering rack, as it's a guide for the shaft. And also on the original steering rack, there is a dust cover. So you gotta make sure you remove this and put this on the new one. All right, now the steering rack is complete. It's got all the parts on it. Like I said, new inner tie rods, new boots. You also want to get your dowel that's over here. You want to make sure you swap that from one to the other, just in case it's not on there. All the plastic covers and everything. It is all on there. And now I have to change the seals on the lines that go inside here, and then we can put the steering rack on the car. Okay, so the steering rack comes with some new O-rings for the lines. So we're just gonna change those out. Let's clean these off. Use a little tool to lift them up, bring them out. All right, so here's no O-ring. You gotta make sure when you put it in that you just put a little bit of fluid on here just so it kind of lubes it up. And then next we do the other one, which is right over here. Okay, so the new one is on there. Take a look at your hoses. Mine are, they got a little corrosion on them, but they're not in terrible shape, so I think I'm just gonna leave them for right now. But I'm just gonna keep an eye on these for in the future. Make sure that nothing happens to them. All right, so now it's time to put the steering rack back in the car. All right, so I got it in, kind of lined up with the hole. So the next thing I'm gonna do, bolt the steering rack back up to the subframe. All right, let's get these things started by hand. All right, so now I'm gonna try to get the shaft back on. Let's see how much of a pain this is gonna be. Got a long ways to go. Oh, this is so difficult. It's just so really tight on there. I'm putting a lot of force. If I was able to stand up, I'd probably be able to do it no problem, but on your back, you can't put that much force on it. It's taking a lot of extra work. And then you can see in there, I'm still really close, and I think I'm gonna tighten down the steering rack and get the whole subframe all tightened up. I think I should be able to wiggle it in from there. 48 foot-pounds on this. All right, so let's tighten up these. I loosen this one up, I loosen that one, and I loosen this one over here. These are 118 foot-pounds, and this is 74 foot-pounds. 118. Okay, so the subframe is back up, and let's try wiggling this again. I'm gonna try to do this off camera. I need to get 2 hands in here, and the camera is in one place where I need to put my other arm, so. All right, so I finally got that shaft onto the steering gear, and what ended up happening is that the way that the camera was, I needed to get my arm in where the camera was in order to grab it with two hands and kind of wiggle it down. Once I did that, threw on a set of gloves. These were actually, some of the sharp edges starting to cut through and it was starting to hurt. So I put on some heavier gloves. When I was able to wiggle it a bunch of times, and I finally got it down far enough where I can get the bolt in and tighten down the shaft. And that thing gets torqued down to 17 foot-pounds. So you just have to know that the hardest part so far doing this whole thing is getting that shaft back on the steering gear. So be prepared for that. And I am done for today. Tomorrow I will finish this up. Okay, so it's been a couple days later and I'm starting to finish up on the car. And I went out to the store and I picked up the proper power steering fluid for the car, which is the Pentosan CHF 11S. So this is what I'm going to be using in the car. And now the next thing I'm going to do is connect up the power steering hoses onto the steering rack so we can start finishing this thing up. Okay, so next is the power steering lines over here. I'm just going to put a little bit of power steering fluid on the O-rings, make them slide in a little bit easier. Okay, the O-ring is hanging up on it. So it looks like one of the O-rings that they sent was the wrong size. I don't have a new one for other than what they sent me, but luckily enough my old one was still very soft, so I'm going to go with using the old one. I'm just going to have to monitor the lines and just keep an eye on to make sure nothing's leaking. It slid right in. Now the bracket that holds it in place and the hex bolt. All right, that's tight. I can start finishing up the rest of the suspension that I didn't put back together, and also some of the subframe bars. Okay, these get torqued to 74 foot-pounds. And next we'll put back up the cover. I broke one of these clips, so I'm not gonna put this one back on. I'll just put this one back on and I have to go pick up a new one for over here. Wouldn't be a bad idea if you're gonna start messing around underneath here like this to have some of these clips floating around. Okay, so next is to put on the outer tie rods, and I also have to connect up that one sway bar link that I disconnected when I was lowering the subframe. And this gets torqued at 34 foot-pounds. Okay, next is the outer tie rods. Okay, let's put this thing on the same amount of turns it was last time. I had 26, so we're gonna put 26 turns on this. And this gets torqued to 56 foot-pounds. And don't forget to tighten up the tie rod locking nut. You don't have to go too crazy on this thing. Just make sure it's really tight, because you're gonna be bringing it for alignment and someone's gonna be taking it apart, so don't crank it down too hard. All right, and repeat that for the other side. Okay, so it's time to fill up the power steering fluid. When fully drained, this uses, I think it's 1.7 liters, but obviously we're not gonna fill that much up with this thing because I didn't completely drain it, only mostly. All right, that is completely full. And now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna turn the steering wheel back and forth. I'm gonna make this thing work a little bit and try to force some of that fluid through. All right, so I moved the steering wheel back and forth a few times. Let's see if it sucked any of it through. Yeah, I don't think it really did. Yeah, it's still really high. I'm gonna try it a few more times. I might have to pump some of this thing out. I thought I lost a little bit more than about a liter, but I apparently not, so let's try this again. Nope, it's still really full, so I'm gonna have to pump a little of that out. So I really want to talk to you about why it is so important that you have the steering wheel locked when you're doing this, and also straight too. Reason being is if you're not careful when you're doing this, now that there's no resistance from the steering rack, there is a possibility that the steering wheel can actually spin all the way down and upside down. The issue with that is, now when you go to spin it back, which way did it come from? Did it come from this way or did it come from this way? you're never gonna know. Clock spring here for the ABS, it can only spin so many times in one direction, and the same thing in the other direction. If you corrected the steering wheel and brought it around 360 degrees, when you go to turn, you can go past the clock spring and break it. I had that hood prop that came up in here and that locked it in place. You can use something else, jam something in between the seat and the steering wheel. They make tools that rest on the seat that you push up will hold the bottom of the steering wheel when you do alignment. So if you do anything like that to hold the steering wheel, you should be good to go. Okay, so what I did is I drained a little bit of the fluid out, rechecked it again, and I got it at the bottom at the cold. So the car is cold and now the thing is level, so now I know exactly where it should be. I would take it out for a drive next, come back in and double check it to make sure that the level is not over the hot line, and then you should be good to go and get your alignment done. You know, the only thing that's really difficult about this whole job is just trying to get that steering shaft back onto the steering gear. So that's really difficult. I think it has to do with the fact that I'm on my back on the ground. If you got a lift, it'll definitely be a lot easier for you. So please subscribe, like this video, and don't forget to ring that notification bell so you know when I'm coming out with my next video. All right, thanks for watching.